Magos, report.
There has been a breach in the security system. They are releasing him.
No, not him. Here we go. All ones. So today, on All Ones, I have a man who needs no introduction, Mr. Andy Chambers, who has made more games than we have probably played. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I've worked, to my great pride and slight embarrassment, for 31 years now, professionally in the gaming industry, mostly in tabletop games, some computer game work as well, and general authorship and writing down the years. Most people know me from Games Workshop, where I spent 14 years at the start of my career working on, first of all, Space Marine, the epic sort of scale stuff, and then graduating onto 40K, where I did second through fourth editions of 40K, a lot of codexes, a lot of battle reports with Jervis Johnson, both in epic and 40K down the years. And yeah, my face was in White Dwarf a lot, it must be said, a lot hairier back then. But
you had quite a distinct style then too. Yeah.
Well, I was a heavy metal kid, so you know it was my icon, Lemmy. I wanted to grow out a moustache and look like him, and just generally look older as well, as you do when you're young. And after Games Workshop, I freelanced for a year, did Starship Troopers miniatures game, wrote a novel, Necromunda novel, which I'd worked on when I was at Workshop, because we also did other games apart from 40K. We did Gorka Morka, Necromunda, Battlefleet Gothic, all squeezed out in between doing new editions of 40K. So I freelanced for a bit. Then I got a job with Blizzard over in California. I worked there for 4 years, worked on StarCraft 2 as lead writer. And kind of after that, I went back to freelancing because that was kind of what I'd found had made me happiest. And I've done all kinds of things since then. Written novels. I've done a load more tabletop games over the years, and more computer game stuff as well here and there. So it's been quite entertaining. And yeah, I worked it out once, I average a new game every 2 years, apparently. So the odds are you'll have run across one of mine at some point. Or somebody nicking my ideas in a different game. That's always possible. So I nick other people's ideas for my games all the time. So plagiarize, it's why God gave us eyes.
What kind of games did you play? How'd you get into gaming?
Really young. It's all my dad's fault in a way, because he used to be like an aero modeler. He used to build flyable gliders and aircraft out of balsa wood and tissue paper and dope and glue and all this sort of stuff. And I actually had a big Hurricane model hanging up in my bedroom when I was a kid, and a Sopwith Camel as well, which is a World War I fighter. Hurricane's World War II fighter, for those who don't know. Very famous, both of them in the UK. They're kind of quite iconic. And that kind of, I don't know, maybe that seated it early. I was always interested in like toy soldiers and models in general. My dad got me a subscription to Military Modeling magazine, which is a very staid publication about painting in Napoleonic hussars and things like that, and making dioramas. But occasionally it would have articles in it about gaming, quite often like a battle report or something like that, which kind of opened up my eyes to it as a possibility in the first place. Plus, there were these radical new science fiction and fantasy miniatures starting to appear as well, which I always found very exciting, because I was a big fan of... Have you seen Captain Scarlet and stuff like that? Do you get them?
I've read a lot of 2000 AD, so
okay, that kind of came later.
Yeah, I like a lot of bit
later, and that was a big influence on me in my early years as well. But when I was very, very young, it was Thunderbirds and stuff like that being on TV.
Oh yeah,
the zany sci-fi sort of thing. I was really into the idea of it. So out of all the things that I saw, I'm most sort of like fixated onto the science fiction fantasy side of things more than the historical, although historical's always been a bit of a bedrock, it must be said. And because I have the good fortune to have been born in Nottingham, in the United Kingdom, it's kind of ground zero for a lot of tabletop gaming companies. I used to, when I was young, hang around at a place called Asgard Miniatures, which is where a lot of the Citadel crew kind of like graduated from there up to creating Games Workshop. So Jez Goodwin was there for a while when I was there. Brian Ansell used to be a partner in it as well, and then he went his own way and got Citadel Miniatures together and so on. So there was kind of like a nepotism network in there. So my very, very first start at Games Workshop was working in mail order there, because I knew somebody who needed part-time workers because the Christmas rush was on. So I went and worked mail order there on a couple of years at Christmas.
Oh wow! I always thought you started as a game developer there.
No, well, it's a big jump from one to the other, to be fair. But the reason that I managed to get a foot in the door at the studio, as it was, which was an entirely separate, off in a different place, ivory tower, as the guys at the factory see it, was because I knew somebody who'd already made that jump and was over at the studio and said, "Oh, hey, Jervis Johnson's on sabbatical at the moment. That's why nobody's written a one-man Titan article yet." And I'm just there playing with Titans, and I've got these one-man Titans going, "Where are the rules for it? Damn it!" And in the past, I'd written bits of rules and rules for myself anyway. So I wrote a White Dwarf article. I tried to copy their style as much as I could, put little quotes in it and all this sort of thing, doing rules and a bit of background for one-man Titans. And they liked it enough to bring me in. And that's how I got started at the studio. 2 weeks to finish the article. And the first thing I got to find when I came in the door was, A, Jervis was back. So I was like, oh, well, that's me done then, isn't it? And B, that they already had plenty of ideas about what they wanted to do with one-man Titans, and it wasn't one-man Titans, it was knights, the whole thing about chivalric background, feudal worlds, So I basically had to tear up the article I'd written and start over, which was a good lesson to learn coming in at the ground floor as somebody of like, oh, you're here to do something. Well, what you wrote is very nice and we like it and stuff, but it's not at all what we want. Okay.
What games did you play before getting into Games Workshop stuff? What was your early career in gaming?
Early on, there's a couple of rule sets called Encounter 1 and Encounter 2, which are Encounter 1 spaceship battles with Newtonian physics and pre-plotted movement, both of which are mechanics I learned to royally hate by playing Encounter 1. But it was spaceships, so it was cool. You had little boxes that you crossed off where things got blown up, so it was awesome. Encounter 2 is like it's like a proto Space Hulk in a way. It's a boarding simulator. So designed to be fought down corridors and stuff like that. That's just suggests using like paperback books to form your tabletop with it and stuff like that. This is what we were working with in the 70s and 80s, man.
I think
if you wanted something, you made it yourself. That
some
was
of the best models and tables, I think, were from that era of just poor kids making stuff from trash, and they came up with some cool stuff.
I know, I kind of miss it. And yeah, one of the things I did early on is, the boxes you used to get McDonald's fries in, kind of like shaped boxes. I went and managed to blag a load of them off McDonald's and made them into grav tanks.
Oh, nice.
Cut half a ball, right? Get a ball, cut it in half, slide it into the back, and then you've got like a wedge shape with a curved back.
Awesome. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I play a lot of orcs, so a lot of my stuff is
there you go. You're right on the ground floor then. It's like, I worked for you there, man. We tried to make it easy to just like stick things on, because that's how it should work.
Oh, that's one of the best things about playing them.
So one of the earliest ones, though, is Southeast London Warlords Middle Earth rules. They did like Lord of the Rings, basically.
I'm not familiar with that one.
High and that's because they're antique, man. They're like 1973 or something like that. I have
that's a bit before my time
somewhere. Yeah. And they're very, very old school. It's lots of tables and factors sort of thing. Not easy for a young brain to wrap its head around at all, which is part, I suspect, why I started just like rewriting bits of them so that I would understand them, quite apart from anything else, and also to try and make them a bit more exciting. But yeah, we used to fight, Battle of Minas Morgul all the time.
So what were some of the? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
What were some of the early games that you worked on in your early career as a game developer?
Well, when I got in on the ground floor at the studio at Games Workshop, it was on the strength of playing Adeptus Titanicus. Because I ran across that after it came out. I'd played Rogue Trader 40k a fair bit as well. But when I came across Adeptus Titanicus, I was really struck by it because, and this was important to me because I was very poor at the time, it was a whole game in a box. They had terrain, they had miniatures, they had measurings, rulers, dice and cards, and everything you needed to play was right there in the box. And that was like a giant leap forward. As I said, prior to that, you needed to find everything yourself. You know, the rules might be there in a book, but they would literally, there was nothing else. You had to find miniatures, you had to find tape measures, even dice, the whole 9 yards. Any terrain you wanted, you needed to build it yourself, and so on. So that I really got into Adeptus Titanicus because it was easy, made life very easy, nice assemblable models. You could change the guns on them. It was a great game to play as well. So I was really into Adeptus Titanicus, and that was the strength of that article that I wrote and got in on. So early on, I was doing stuff for Adeptus Titanicus, stuff like the early efforts of like building a Space Marine chapter. Did an article about that, stats for Bane blades and stuff like that, bowel burners and all the other various orc things that came out as little epic miniatures at the time, which were very cool. And just sort of helping out Jervis as well in just playtesting stuff. He was working with, I think he was working on Advanced Space Crusade at the time, and I was helping him out with that. And well, helping out. I played that with him and made my youngling suggestions about what might be different and so on, which he was always very kind about, and a good mentor in general. So Adeptus Titanicus is the short answer, and then Space Marine came along, which actually took Adeptus Titanicus, which had been starting to expand out from just Titans into a ground game already, which was part of what I'd been doing, and made it into a full ground game with tanks and infantry being a major part of it, as well as Titans. And then I got hooked into doing supplements for that. So all the ones past Armies of the Imperium, I did them pretty much solo. The Orc and Squat Warlords, Renegades, Chaos, that was lots of fun. As well as stuff like supplemental material for the main systems. I did a bit of work on the second Realm of Chaos book, just in terms of like doing layout, and worked on stuff for Wog the Orcs. No, it was the second book, Here We Go. I wrote some stuff in there, which is where Gaskell
those three books are hands down, the three orc books from Rogue Trader, hands down, I think the best Games Workshop books ever made.
It was an achievement, certainly. It's definitely one of those, you never stop to think if you should. But they are definitely an achievement. And yeah, so I contributed to those, and amongst other things, I worked on Warhammer Battle Magic and Dark Millennium as well. And that kind of rolled into doing second. I'm getting mixed up, sorry, because I did second edition 40k before I did Dark Millennium, of course. And then that was my major break, which was, oh hey, Rogue Traders. This, people love Rogue Trader. They love playing the game. It had ballooned out by this point to like multiple books, because the actual, you've got the Rogue Trader book. I can see it right there behind you.
Yeah.
So it's like this glorious mishmash. It's kind of like semi a role playing game, and there's like some random tables in it and stuff. But it's not a coherent pick your army fighter game.
It was kind of built kind of like an RPG / war game.
Yeah, so there's a lot of assumption that there'll be a GM involved, probably, who sets up the scenario and gives you what you're going to fight with and all this sort of thing. It didn't revolve around armies and points values and being a competitive system. And a lot of the supplemental material that came out after that was things like army lists, which actually gave you a structure to start building your games around more, because there was this realization that actually what a lot of people wanted to do was just have a fight, rather than have some, write some scenario and then walk people through it. They wanted to have their army and smack, which is something I could get my head around. So all this material had been developed for it. It was starting to turn into I always say, it's an inverted pyramid. Any game is like this. You start off with a point, and it's very sharp and pointy and a great game in itself, and then you build more stuff out. that lets you do more with it, but it becomes inherently unstable as you do so. And sooner or later, the whole thing topples over. And that's when you need a new edition, or preferably just a little bit before that, if you can. And so that's the point they'd hit with 40K. It clearly needed a new edition. Plus, they wanted to do it rather than as a book, as a game in a box, with miniatures and templates and some terrain and the whole 9 yards. So
I
for working
wound
on that.
up saving money for weeks and like almost 2 months to get that box set as a kid.
I have to say, out of all of the many games I've worked on at this point, probably because it was one of the earliest, it was a very satisfying game to work on, because what you got in that box was actually just an excellent little game on its own. Big bunch of orcs and grots, small number of space marines, but they were tough enough to take on what was there, to the point where we had to put a dreadnought in, cardboard dreadnought, so that they could take on the full smash of space marines. But it was a good, satisfying little game to play on its own, a little skirmish game. So yeah, I've got a soft spot for second edition in particular, of course, and it went huge. It went really big, sold ever so well, kind of like springboarded a lot what you see today of like 40K being this all pervasive, grim darkness that's everywhere, is from that second edition, really, because it got so many people, I think, started out in collecting and painting and playing with toy soldiers back in the day.
Yeah, that is where I started from.
Mm.
So what outside of that, what have you worked on in Games Workshop? I know you've worked on Battlefleet Gothic. I think I would be strung up on the internet if I don't mention Battlefleet Gothic. Cheers to the Battlefleet Gothic Facebook page.
Hi, fellas. Well, that's another one of my glorious moments. Really, I really love Battlefleet Gothic to this day. And it kind of, the genesis of that was back when I'd started at the studio, actually back in 1990. Richard Halliwell, hot off the successes of doing Space Hulk, was trying to do a Battlefleet Gothic game, which never saw the light of day in the end, because, well, one of the problems it had was vector movement, and that's the death of all spaceship games. So that never really got off the ground, even though there was like artwork done for it, some miniatures had been made for it. It was very early days, so things like that could still happen on occasion, where all of the pistons were firing except for one, which turned out to be games design, and so it doesn't happen. So those saw the light of day eventually in Space Fleet. Actually, a lot of that artwork and miniatures and some of the old back catalogue that Citadel had of Spaceship Rangers. But it always kind of bothered me in a way that it never saw the full light of day. I didn't particularly like Space Fleet. I felt it was too abstracted. So in my off time, I started working on doing a Battlefleet Gothic game. I built an example of what a Gothic, Battlefleet Gothic ship might be like, which you may have seen pictures of down the years. It's big, it's this big, and I got Jez helped me out by getting a few parts cast for that, and we kind of sold people on the idea of it, and managed to. Rick Priestley, God bless him, managed to wedge it onto the schedule just before we stopped doing, because we were doing 2 games a year at that point. We'd do kind of like a spring release game and a winter release game as well. And the winter release games would be 40K or Warhammer Fantasy. But the other slot in the year could be a Gorka Morka or a Necromunda, or in this case, a Battlefleet Gothic. So we got to do something a bit more wacky on that case. And Battlefleet Gothic just came together really nicely. I worked on it closely with Gav Thorpe as well as Jervis. Gav did the Chaos Fleet pretty much in its entirety and did a lot of the background writing as well, which did great stuff for. He did a lot of the campaign, came from him too. So it was just really nice sort of a joint effort that came together, and a very pleasing result. I'm really tickled by the fact it's still getting played to this day, because it's a good game and it feels right for the subject matter. The ships do feel very kind of chunky. You can hear the metal screaming as they blast away at each other. So I'm very proud of that particular one. must be said. Battlefleet Gothic. So yes, big
You
shout
also
out to the guys still playing.
you also mentioned Necromunda and Gorka Morka, which are two of my favorite games. I honestly think Gorka Morka does not get the recognition that it deserves, as I think it's probably the best vehicle rules of any game out there.
That's a bold claim to make. I don't know if I
I don't
can
know.
back you on that
I
one.
like all how they maneuver. Maybe not the maybe not the damage tables, but the way the trucks maneuver and jumping from each one was really Mad Max. And I like
Well, that was clearly a huge inspiration, and I was really into Mad Max 2 when I was growing up. In the ancient days when the VCR was a new piece of technology. That's video cassette recorder, because they had video cassettes with like tape, like metallized tape, and that's what we used to watch movies on back in the old days. Anyway, when I was still at school and stuff like that, and VHS recorders started coming around, so we got to see all kinds of films that you would never see at the cinema. Mad Max 2 and Mad Max 1, for that matter, were a couple of those. And Mad Max 1's kind of all right, but Mad Max 2 really struck me back in the day and kind of stayed with me. And it's probably the film I've seen more than any other to this day, because I watched it kind of religiously week after week for a while. And it's an amazing film. And so, that whole idea of like what vehicular combat is about guys leaping around and smacking each other on the head very much bled into Gorka Morka. And it's kind of appropriate for orcs anyway. So it was great to see Thunder Road when it came out, because it was like, oh yeah, back to form. Love it.
The first half of Thunderdome was okay. Second half, not so much. Other than that, the Mad Max series is fantastic.
So yeah, Gorka Morka, although as a piece of work, as I've said before in other interviews, it was very fraught for me, because we had to bang it out really quick. It was done in literally 8 weeks.
Oh wow!
As a piece of writing. Yeah, it's the fastest I've ever written a game. Mainly because lots of it is half-inched, raw and bleeding from Necromunda. With the names changed and so on. But then, like you say, there's also a lot of vehicle combat rules in there, a lot of rules that are to do with orcs that I just hammered away, basically, over a mad period to get that out in time. Because, sometimes you don't get told about things until it's a bit late. And it's like, well, we've got this release slot, and we need to hit it.
I'm amazed you were able to do that in 8. You said 8 weeks?
Yes.
Wow. Did you work on Necromunda at all?
Oh yeah. Worked on Necromunda a bunch. Because that dated back. That was another kind of like old game concept. Confrontation, it had been called back in the day, which never again made it to fruition. But there was a lot of ideas, a lot of DNA that came through, but nothing about the game came through, because the early game was, I'd hesitate to say unplayable, but close to unplayable. So the Necromunda was a fresh take on it, basically just using the second edition 40k rules, with a few extra frills attached for fighting in hives and so on, and then it just bags a character on top more than anything else, and rules about recruiting your gang, and then improving with time, with experience, but getting injuries and stuff like that. And me and Jervis worked on that a lot. It was kind of grew out of what he'd done for Blood Bowl in its 4th edition and onward, because we'd learned a lot from doing those. We used to run leagues in the studio for it, and that meant that there was a lot of intense play, so it had been really played a lot. So we had a solid campaign system from there, and we kind of applied that in Necromunda, which again worked well. And then making lots of content, doing the scenarios. That was me, all the scenarios for it.
Oh really?
Yeah. So the system we had was generally Rick would do kind of like the real high-end rules, like the meta. But then the kind of the application of it, if you will, doing the army lists, doing the scenarios, stuff like that, he'd flow that down to the rest of us to junder away with.
So speaking of meta and rules, which one do you find easier and more fun to do, rules or making up the lore of these universes?
I've been asked this question in the past, and my response has always been pretty much 50-50. I'm about half games designer, half writer, in truth, because I know games designers who are a lot more hardcore than I am, really, in terms of the way they think about games and the interactions of games and mechanics and all the rest of it. I feel like a bit of an amateur compared to some of them. But there again, I know a lot more about lore writing than they do.
Mhm.
And vice versa. I know lore writers who can, write me out of a story and back into it before we can blink. But I can tell you an awful lot more about games design than they can. So I kind of bestraddle both worlds to a large extent. I tend to do more tabletop design than anything else these days. But I mentioned I do stuff for computer game companies. That's usually IP development and lore creation specifically. Because while the mechanics for that are very specific and they need, technical types and coders and people who understand mathematics in a way that most of us do not, the lore is still the lore, and you need a way of thinking about that, which I've developed over the years.
So you've worked on both historical and both fiction and nonfiction in games. Which one do you prefer to work for or work with?
I'm sorry, my glib response there is whichever pays the best as a rule of thumb.
Get the Scrooge McDuck answer.
You have to have a little bit of it when you freelance, because you can have the most amazing, glorious products, but if it doesn't pay, ultimately you're not putting bread on the table, and it's a profession as much as anything. That being said, sometimes the really well-paying gigs aren't exactly the most exciting ones either. So it comes down to picking and choosing, and which ones inspire you the most. Part of the skill really is getting inspired by what you're doing. That's what people are bringing you in for. And so your personal predilections about what you may be doing are best put towards trying to get the best out of where you're actually at, rather than where you'd like to be at. I don't know. I'm probably not making very much sense there, am I?
I think you are, actually. But you gotta kind of pick and choose. Do you gotta do what you enjoy, but you also got to be able to make a living at it.
Yes, but it's a fine balance. If something genuinely does evoke excitement, then the making a living part of it is kind of like less of a pressing concern there. If it definitely does not provoke excitement, then the making a living part is very much at the fore part of your mind about is this worth it or not. One of the reasons I tried my hand at novel writing for a few years. Did some stuff for Black Library. I did a trilogy of Dark Eldar books, and I'd written a Necromunda novel previous to that. But one of the things I found about that, as much as I enjoy writing long form fiction and short form as well, I did short stories too, I'm kind of too slow at it to make a living, is the sad truth. So I did those books and called it done at that point. Whereas like Gav, who used to work with, Graham McNeil used to work with, they've both gone into like full on novel writing, and they're up to like 40, 50 novels written and things like this at this point. Yeah, they're serious about it. And that's one of those things of like, that's one of those places where being a bit 50-50 doesn't serve me very well, because being able to write novels is a talent, a skill, I should say, because you can work on it and you can develop it better. There's some talent involved as well, but it's a skill. And I haven't developed that skill. I can't gallop along and do multiple novels a year, which is what you need to do to make it into a living, basically, rather than something you like to do or have aspirations to do. Nothing wrong with that either, by the way.
So as somebody who worked during what many would call the golden age of Games Workshop, what was the creative process like? You've talked a little bit about this, but what was a creative process like at Games Workshop?
Fairly headlong overall. We had schedules to keep. We had a fairly fierce release schedule to maintain at all times, and we had White Dwarf magazine every month, which also required material content creating for that. So the creative process was, have you ever seen the like Spider-Man movies where you've got J. Jonah Jameson in there going like, I want pictures of Spider-Man now? It was kind of like that all the time, if I'm entirely honest. And the amount of time for sort of like introspection and consideration was fairly limited. We got better about that over time. and learn to try and like plan out what was coming down the pike a little bit more. But often it was a case of meeting immediate needs of these miniatures have been made, there's nothing written for them, there's no articles go with them to support them. And it was generally acknowledged at this point you need to support releases on, with art and words and the miniatures themselves. It was a tripod. So miniatures usually had the longest lead time, but they had a nasty habit of not telling us until they were done, basically. And then you got to like, okay, what have we got? Well, it looks like a rhino with a pipe organ on it, so let's try and do that.
I remember that model. I believe
to be fair to that model, that was one actually where we planned for it and said we want a rhino with a pipe organ on it. No, actually, I'm more thinking about something like the Razorback, which just turned up out of nowhere one day, as far as I was concerned. It was like, oh, we need rules for it.
It was always kind of wonky. Being a 5-man transport was kind of weird. But I remember,
yeah, well, it got a dirty great turret on top of it. So
yeah.
What was it supposed to
do? So, what have you been doing since you've worked at Games Workshop?
Well, I say did the Games Workshop thing, then Blizzard for a while. Did Starship Troopers in between that and a novel. After that, I've done various tabletop games. I did Dust Warfare. I did Dropfleet Commander, which is quite nice. Beautiful miniatures for it as well. I recommend that if you like spaceship games. One of the things I kind of developed off my own back down the years was a game called Blood Red Skies, which this is what goes back to having a Hurricane model hanging off my ceiling when I was a kid. It's a World War II fighter combat game.
That's Warlord Games, if I remember right. Correct?
Yeah. I do a lot of work with Warlord these days because I moved back to the UK in 2011 after being over in America for 6 years. And Warlord's based in Nottingham as well. It's got a lot of ex-Games Workshop types. It's actually, Paul Sawyer and John Stallard are the guys behind it, who were both very big at Games Workshop back in my day. So they know me, I know them, and I've done a fair bit of work for them. And I took Blood Red Skies to them and said, look, I've developed this game. I just did it for myself because I think it's a nice idea. And they really liked it, God bless them. And they were willing to actually publish it for me, though I had to wait for a couple of years because their schedule was full. This is what happens. You plan at least a couple of years ahead. But eventually we got on the schedule. That was like 4 years ago now, I think it was released.
Oh, wow.
And it's done pretty well. I've been doing new stuff for it and supplements, and we're just about to release a new starter set for it. First starter set we did was Battle of Britain, so it was Spitfires and Messerschmitts and all very boys' stuff for here in the United Kingdom. The next starter set we're doing is for the Battle of Midway, however, which has got a similar grip on the American imagination, because it is a turning point of the war, which is mainly an aerial, well, it's entirely an aerial fight. So we've got Wildcats versus Zeros, trying to either stop or escort bombers through. And it's a good little game. I'm very proud of it, actually.
Oh, yeah. I'd like to see one on China, the American mercenaries who were over there with the Warhawks. Fly those around.
Honestly, you could play that right now with Blood Red Skies because it's within the period that it covers. I mean, you're talking P40s versus some of the earlier, is it K27s? I can't remember. You get very early Zeros in 1940, but prior to that, you've got different Japanese aircraft and so on. But it's an absolute mud farm. It really is, because there's also some Russian aircraft involved. You get I-16s and stuff like that. So it's an interesting period, and it's one I've thought about doing some stuff for Blood Red Skies specifically. So, Spanish Civil War is very similar as well.
Yeah, I was just about to ask: is there different time periods that you're doing in Blood Red Skies?
We've done MiG Alley. We've done Korea because it covers the Second World War, so it covers the early jets, the Me-262s and stuff like that. So we've got jet rules in place. So doing Sabres versus MiGs for the Korean War wasn't a stretch. It's quite a different game because everything's so fast. In comparison, it's kept all the scale and stuff together the same. But it's an interesting one. We've been trying to figure out how to do the do missiles for later periods as well.
Oh yeah.
So we can maybe do NAM at some point. So we've done that. What else have we done with it? We've done 1/72 scale as well, because the game the Warlord does is 1/200 scale. So, well, your dudes are about
Oh yeah.
that big. It's a fuck
Oh, yeah.
190.
I think I only have BattleTech handy around my table right now.
But 1/72 scale planes are very commonly available through Airfix, and we've done a deal with Airfix where we do a 1/72 scale version of the game as well.
Oh wow.
So you play with less aircraft, slightly different rules, but not very different, because it's just a really solid mechanism that's behind Blood Red Skies. So yeah, that's.
I think I'm going to have to go down and track down one of those starter boxes. I'm really interested in the Korea, the Mig Alley one. That one sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
Where go ahead.
I was just going to say, if that's what you're interested in, then you can get into that now. You just need to buy Airstrike, which is a rules book, and you'd need Mig Alley box set, which gives you two MiGs and 2 sabers. I think. You might want more than one of those.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What else are you doing over there at Warlord Games? Is it just Blood Red Skies, or are you working on a lot more?
Primarily that. I've done. No, that's a complete lie. Not primarily that at all. God, mind blank. We talked about 2000 AD at one point a little while ago. You said you used to read 2000.
I'm a huge 2000.
So did I. Yeah, so did I back in the day. It was very much part of my formative years. And even before Games Workshop got at me, so Nemesis, Warlock, and Judge Dredd, Strontium Dog, all that sort of stuff. Warlord Games has got the license for doing tabletop miniatures games for 2000 AD. Days. So
did they just drop Strontium Dogs?
Strontium Dog was a few years back now, actually.
Okay. Yeah.
That was the first one we did, and it's a good little skirmish game. Actually, people really like that. I worked on that with Gav Thorpe again, which was really nice.
Oh.
And again, he did the campaign stuff for that, the scenarios and the background text. So that's a nice bundle. And then Judge Dredd, did the Judge Dredd game as well. Did that with Roger Gerish, which fundamentally the reason we did Strontium Dog first was to try out what we would hope to use as like a universal system for all of the 2000 AD games. And it works well enough that it's the same system in Judge Dredd, which is one of the appeals. They actually work with each other fine. You can take Strontium Dog characters, find them in Judge Dredd, and vice versa, which is cool because that's what happens in the comics. We've done another one since then for Slain, which is the fantasy sort of barbarian title. 2000 AD.
Honestly, I haven't read much of it, but art in that comic was fantastic.
It's always beautiful art. It's beautiful art. It's a bit tougher to make a game out of than Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog was, but I think we succeeded there. Made something quite interesting with it, though we did have to make a few tweaks to the system on that one to turn it from a guns game into smacking each other with axes game instead. So that's been an ongoing series, and we're hoping to do more in the future as well.
Any chance are you guys looking at maybe Nemesis and Warlock or ABC Warriors?
We've talked about both of them, and we're working towards one of those. I think I can safely say right now. So yes, and Nemesis may well make his way out there eventually as well. So you can figure out which one we're talking about.
I think ABC Warriors would be a lot easier to do than Nemesis, but both of them have very good factions that can fight against each other.
The question with Nemesis is, do you do it as a tabletop miniatures game or do you do it as a race game?
I don't know. Why not?
Who's the bigger character? Is it Nemesis or the Blitz Spear?
You got the same kind of concept as Gorka Morka fighting along those highways, and
fair point. Jumping.
Who doesn't want to shoot some Terminators?
Yeah, you may have a good point there. So yeah, in theory, that's all up for grabs. 2000 AD titles. The main constraint that Warlord has is they can't just pump out loads of Judge Dredd stuff all the time. They have to do some of the other strips as well, which is great for us gamers. So that's going on. I did some historical stuff for them as well. I did a few of the bolt action books that are out there.
Which bolt action books did you work on? I play a lot of the Shuttle and Oh man, I just had a brain fart. The one that has the tertios and pikemen. I can't remember the name of it.
Black
Sorry.
powder.
Yeah, black powder.
Black powder. There we go. Yeah, I did bolt action. I did armies of the Soviet Union, Ostfront, which is a campaigns book, and Empires in Flames, which is another campaign book for Pacific War. So just those 3 titles for bolt action.
Yeah, well, you said you worked for Blizzard. Would you like to talk a little bit about your time there?
Yeah, it was very eye-opening. I moved to California. They magic carpeted me over there and paid me large sums of money to come and work in California for a time, which was a bit like living in a Martian colony in many ways for somebody from like rain-soaked Britain, just like the constant blaze of the sun.
I'm personally in the Northwest United States, so I have much the same kind of weather.
Yeah, and I don't know, big time, proper Hollywood video game. My first experience working in video games as well. So all a big shock to the system, really. And as an excited player of video games, I had never really kind of grasped how complex they were in the making as well. So it was a real education in that of how faceted video game production is and how interdependent so many different things of it are. So yeah, it was a real education, and wonderful people over there at Blizzard. Over the time we were there, we moved from like little offices on like an industrial park into this like 1,000-person campus with a cafeteria and a gym and all the rest of it, and a big bronze statue. So it was kind of like,
oh, I didn't realize Blizzard was that big.
Yeah, it was funny because like when I arrived there, they sort of didn't feel like they were, but it was at the time when they were making megabucks out of WoW, World of Warcraft.
Oh yeah, I totally forgot they did that.
Yeah, because I joined them in 2005, and yeah, they were doing very, very well indeed. So it wasn't at first apparent because they were pretty much in their old offices sort of thing, doing their old thing. But over the time we were there, well, actually the first big giveaway is when we went over to Seoul in Korea to do the announcement for doing StarCraft 2, because it was huge in Korea. StarCraft 1 was huge in Korea, like to the point when we went over there to make this announcement, the hotel TV had 2 stations dedicated to StarCraft 1 games.
Oh, wow.
Because, you know, it was a full-on competitive sport. First proper e-sport as far as they were concerned, as far as the rest of the world's concerned, I think, as well. So, yeah, we went over to Seoul in Korea because they had a big esports events there. And they were going to announce during StarCraft 2 that it was coming. And they'd hired out the Olympic Stadium and filmed it.
Wow.
Now, granted, it wasn't the only thing they were coming for. You know, they'd come for this massive tournament, Warcraft tournament primarily, but also StarCraft as well. But yes, indeed, and that's the point when you know you're not quite in Kansas anymore.
So
yeah.
what was the creative process like? Let's touch back on Warlords. What's the creative process there like?
With Warlord?
Yes. Sorry, I kind of bounced around. I should have stayed on topic. I'm not a professional at this.
I'm trying to focus and think. What is the creative process like with Warlord? It generally consists of Paul Sawyer sending me emails, going like, "We have these things that we're working on," and well, no, sorry, it breaks down into 2 things. There's one where I send him emails going like, "We're going to do this thing, and you know, tell me when you want it doing by." And then there's ones when I've done the thing and sent it to him, and he sends things back to me going like, "Is this right?" And me going like, "No." That's what the creative process with Warlord is like, as a rule of thumb. There isn't, it's not all no, but it's finding things that make you go, ah. So it's always a bit exciting. They're very good to me overall. Basically, if I pitch an idea to them, they'll give it serious consideration, and if they can put it on their schedule, they will. Equally, when they've got things on their schedule that they think will be suitable for me, they ask me if I want to do them. So in between that, I guess the creative process is the same as it ever was, with that sort of like mad dash that I described earlier on for Games Workshop. Because honestly, that's where we learned it.
Mhm.
You know, Paul Sawyer was White Dwarf editor for about a decade while I was there as well. So we do interact with each other, knowingly or not, pretty much on that level of like, it's still J. Jonah
I
Jameson.
remember an article he put in about how to make the
Just
perfect cup of
Spider-Man.
tea, and I still
Uh,
live by that one.
He's a man of great talents, is Paul.
Okay. So what was the creative process at Blizzard like?
Creative process at Blizzard. Long ranging. I touched on how many different disciplines are involved in making a video game. It's very simple. The tabletop game. You need art, you need miniatures, you need words,
Mhm.
and that's really all you need. So you can do it with two people if they're one person if they're talented enough, two people if they're fairly talented, three if they're just average Joes like me.
Mhm.
So a team that has to work on something in Blizzard it kind of starts at around 50 people
Whoa.
and goes up to 250 later. So one of the first things that the creative process has to do is get everybody on board. They need to know where they're going, why, what's cool about it, and get to say their piece and buy into it from their respective disciplines. How does it look? How does it sound? How does it animate? So that there's a big round robin process, and it means that everyone has to be very, very kind to each other, quite apart from anything else. Unlike that 3-person slugging match sort of thing, you can't have a 50-person brawl over everything. So it's a kind of longer process, and in many ways it's a gentler process because it is about showing options rather than this is what we're doing, and being reactive to feedback from people, because in the realm of video games, that feedback can mean very real things for the game, not just in kind of the lore or something like that, but in how things actually look and sound and how they interact with the player experience and so on. So there are 1,000 invisible threads that tie it all together. So it's a lot more of a delicate process, definitely, working at a video game. That's what I learned at Blizzard. I was astounded by their kindness to each other when I first arrived. Genuinely was. How nice everyone was. So the answer what the creative process is like. You take a thing, you produce a thing, you talk about the thing, you make changes according to what you talk about. That's fairly universal, but it's very strongly there at a place like Blizzard.
What has been your favorite game to work on, as being a man who's worked on so many?
Favorite?
And which one you've had the most fun working on?
Oh God, I have fun with all of them. Is the truth, or at least I try to, because that's part of the point, really. It's a toss-up, really. I mentioned Battlefleet Gothic as just being really pleasing. That's one of the ones I had the most fun on, if I'm honest. I had a lot of fun with Necromunda as well, actually, particularly doing the Outlanders supplement, which is where we put in Redemptionists and Scavies and all the extreme stuff. I had a lot of fun with that. In more recent times, Strontium Dog actually was all of the 2000 AD games, if I'm honest, have been an absolute wheeze to work on, because you spend your time kind of like alternating between actually playing games with like Johnny Alpha and stuff like that, and honestly looking for artwork through, which is such a terrible task. It really is, having to read through old 2000 ADs looking for the right pictures and stuff like that. So that's very pleasing, and I really had a big kick out of doing those. The other one that's really sort of like stood out for me is Blood Red Skies. It's probably the simplest game I've ever written, but it's also kind of I think it has been the cleverest one I've ever written. So playing with that, developing it over 4 years, that's been a lot of fun too.
Hey, could you tell us a little bit about Dropfleet?
Dropfleet Commander. That was one where I got in touch with the guys at Hawk Wargames because I kept seeing pictures of these fantastic, really nice sci-fi 6 mil epic scale, as I tend to think of it, sci-fi stuff. for their game Drop Zone Commander. So I got in touch with them and said, "Hey guys, I really like your models. I think they're really cool. I'd like to do some work for you, if you're up for it." And they said, "Ha, Andy Chambers, we know you. In fact, we are massive fans of Battlefleet Gothic, and we are thinking of doing a spaceship game set in the Drop Zone Commander universe using the same factions, but spaceships." And I was like, I am so signed up for that. I absolutely was. So, and they did it as a Kickstarter. It did really well. It actually kind of blew up Hawk because it did a bit too well. They couldn't handle it in terms of the actual number that they had to ship in the end. So that was very, very successful. And Dropfleet Commander's a really interesting game. It's a take on 3D-ness that I've been thinking about for Battlefleet Gothic for a number of years, about having layers. Because Dropfleet Commander revolves around the idea that you're trying to drop troops onto a planet's surface. You're trying to win a battle from orbit. So it was all orbital battles. So that gave it a really nice sort of like dynamic and an element to it right from the outset. So yeah, that was good fun developing that as well. Still available. It's TTG has it now because they bought up Hawk.
And we have quite a following from that here in Portland, Oregon. So,
Dropfleet Commander or Drop Zone Commander or both?
I think it's both the space game and the land-based game. They usually play it together. I don't play it quite that much, but they're always at the game store with us doing other games.
Great models.
Oh yeah, they're fantastic.
The game's all right as well.
So, what is your favorite Warhammer Fantasy and 40K faction to play, or to just work on, or whatever?
For Warhammer, it's quite easy because it's Skaven.
Oh yeah.
I didn't do an awful lot of work with Warhammer before getting drawn into doing 40K. So the High Elf book was one I did. Yeah. And the Skaven book was one I did, which was great fun, and I love Skaven armies, always did. So that's easy. Yeah. So that's easy. For 40K, it's harder. Excuse me. But I'd have to probably say Orcs as being the things I had most fun with playing in 40K, both in epic scale and in 40K scale. But I did enjoy playing Tyranids quite a lot as well, and Imperial Guard. Basically, anything swarmy, I had a good time with.
It's but they're always a little bit more time consuming to paint because there's so many models, but so much more fun.
Yes, and you end up like shoveling them all on, then shoveling them back off again. But I don't know. I don't like having very small elite forces personally. As a personal take, I understand they're powerful. I make them that way in the games I do because they're small and elite and so on. And I understand the attraction of getting them because, for one, it's a smaller army you have to collect. But I don't particularly like playing them, if you see what I mean. So I do gravitate towards like they're tons of crap armies more than anything else.
Well, can I switch over to some fan questions now?
Sure.
And so Bane McGregor asked, how was it returning to 40K universe when working on working on Fantasy Flight RPGs?
I did some stuff for Fantasy Flight. Thank you, well remembered. Honestly, Ross, the guy here at Fantasy Flight, had such an expansive kind of overview of 40K and had done all these books already. I basically just did what he asked of me more than anything else. It was a little odd coming back to it in some ways because everything that went through Fantasy Flight then went to Games Workshop's like IP department to be checked over. So I'd get feedback from Games Workshop's IP department about like, well, we're not sure about this and so on. What, like, I don't know, you fools. But of course things have changed since then, and what I knew back in the day wasn't necessarily what the IP department was doing at the time. So yeah, it was a bit of an education on that front of like, something but you don't know it anymore, not like you used to or like you think you do, basically.
David Humphreys asks, what's your favorite part of the hobby? Play, and apart from the orcs, as they're the best. That's actually what he put in the question.
Okay, apart from the others, because they is the best. Yeah.
He actually spelled it that way too.
Of course he did. We know our culture, Kay. And my favorite part of the hobby is probably painting the miniatures, actually, funnily enough. I don't know. It's a split between that and actually gaming with them.
Mhm.
But it's weird, painting the miniatures, as much as it's a chore and it's a task and it's something that it has done, I do get a lot out of it. Even now, I've actually, despite my failing eyesight and all the rest of it, I've gone back to starting to paint miniatures again. So I think there's something very zen about it. But obviously you can't beat a game where I think with games I'm a bit more ambivalent about them because they can be so good or so bad.
Mhm.
And a lot of it depends literally on your dice rolling on the day. And I say this as an experienced games designer. I acknowledge it because you are just the victim of the dice sometimes, or
Oh, yeah.
the absolute conquering hero because of the dice sometimes. And neither is a terribly satisfying experience when it happens to you. But that being said, when you can pull something off against the odds, there's nothing quite like it.
That is why I named my channel All Ones. Is you're a victim of the dice.
I think we have a very selective memory process, though, where we do tend to remember it was the dice that screwed us rather than we did it to ourselves through our appalling lack of planning, as a rule of thumb.
Jonathan Durant asks, "Are you still involved in Dropfleet?"
Not directly, no, not since it. Well, not since we published the main game. Actually, they took it in house, and Dave Lewis is quite capable with rules. He wrote Dropzone Commander in the first place, so he handles the stuff to do with Dropfleet now. I have, kept an eye on it and see the new stuff coming out and so on. I actually have Dropfleet fleets,
Mhm.
so I've been kind of tempted to expand them a bit, but there's so many other things to try and grab your attention all the time. I can't confess I have.
Lindsay Fay asks, "What's your personal favorite / most contribution to the hobby? What is your legacy as a gamer or game developer, basically?"
Um, I'd like to think that I have worked to try and make games, believe it or not, more accessible over the time that I've worked in the hobby. Like I say, I came up through the 70s and 80s, and games were not very accessible back then. They were kind of hard to get your head around. You had to have a certain mindset to play them, and so on. And I'd like to think that over my time, my 30 years that I've spent, I've helped to show that games can be all kinds of different things. They can work in different ways. That they can be flexible. They can be as much a tool set that you give to players to make their own games and have fun with them, as they are a set of board games rules where you can only make prescribed moves with a set number of pieces. And that's an ugly process sometimes. It's not always, as I said, you get all ones, things work against you, make a bad plan, etc. But that to me has always been where the fun is, rather than the rather more sort of like chess champions clinical approach to gaming. So yeah, making games fun, I think, is really what I've always aimed to do. And I feel that myself and others with a similar mindset, Jervis in particular, have had an impact over the years. And tabletop gaming is, I'd like to think, a lot more fun now than when we started. So that, I think.
Lindsay Fay also asked, "What is something you've always wanted to implement in games but have never had a chance?"
Okay, I touched on this earlier, my personal bugbear about games born from Encounter 1 when I was young are two things: pre-plotted movement and vector movement. That's Newtonian physics, where you thrust in one direction, you turn around, you're still thrusting in that direction. I want to overcome both of those. I want to make a game that's easy to play and fun that uses both of those mechanics.
Mhm.
That's my personal challenge to myself, because I've deliberately designed games that avoided them so many times in the past, specifically spaceship games. Who are like, no, we're not doing it that way for a start. But it's kind of it's a challenge to myself now at that point to like overcome both of those. It's like Iron Chef challenge of like, you get spinach and garlic. What are you going to make?
Chris Van Wark. I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing that last name wrong. Uh, there are reports that you've claimed that Mad Uruk Thraka isn't named for an 80s prime minister. Can you clear that up? And was that just a resemblance of coincidence?
Yes, I can absolutely clear that up. It's in no way related to Margaret Thatcher. Gazgul Mag Uruk Thraka is a breakdown of black speech words that me and my chums developed when we were live action role playing back in the day and played as orcs. So we dutifully went through our Lord of the Rings and pulled out every word we could find in black speech and assembled about 30, I think, as a rough sort of language that we would use. Gazga is metal. Kul is skull. Mag is big. Uruk is, mighty warrior, basically. So metal skull, mighty warrior, big mighty warrior, is what his name means. Now, Enterprising Sorts, when it came out, went, oh, Mag Uruk Thacker, it must be Thatcher. She loomed large in our heads in those days.
Oh, yeah.
Similarly does now to people of a certain age like myself. So I can understand why it happened. And I firmly believe that a large number of guys in retail were told that joke and then took it out to the masses. It's like Skaven. There was a rumor going around that they were named after some cartoon rat character. We used to go, he is Kevin. And it's like shortened down, Skaven. And it's not, it comes from the word scavengers.
Oh.
But, that doesn't make a funny story to tell. So people don't tell that quite so often as the here's Kevin story.
So, Anthonus Gladius, I'm pronouncing that wrong, asks, do you miss your distinctive look that you rocked back in the day? You gave 40K and Games Workshop a very rebel attitude of the time.
Yes, in a way. But I mean, by 1996, I shaved off my moustache because I'd said to myself I was going to do it when I turned 30 years old, and I did at a party. Because I didn't need any help looking older at that point, or so I thought. And my hair, unfortunately, I inherited, among other things, from my dad. I inherited his male pattern baldness, so I don't get to be mad and hairy anymore. I'm glad that I was for the time that I was, but it would just be sad now to try and be hairy like that. It really would.
I have the same issue, so I feel you there.
Yes, age is a cruel master.
So who has influenced you the most as a games developer?
Oh, that's easy. Jervis Johnson.
Could you go into a little bit on that?
Sorry. Just like Jervis. And Rick as well, to be fair. Rick Priestley has had a lot of influence. So with Jervis, like I say, it started out, I used to share an office with him right when I started out. So I learned a lot from him by osmosis just from doing that and working on things like Advanced Space Crusade with him and playtesting a lot, particularly when he did Blood Bowl and so on. And Jervis was really the one who germinated that idea of like, games should be fun. Games should be playable and fun. And worked hard to try and build that into the games he was playing. And it's like, I learned a lot from that. And I learned a lot from his openness to people playing, playtest results, seeing what people struggle with in a game, what they didn't, and understanding that a game isn't just like words on a page. You've got to be able to get it into people's heads. It's got to be able to stick as well. So you can't just produce fat paragraphs of text and expect people to memorize it and fish out what the rules are from within that. They have to be core concepts in there that are strong, easy to remember, applicable, and seem appropriate for the game that you're playing. However you manage to achieve that. So for Blood Bowl, for example, the whole thing with block dice. Could have done that with like dice rolls, D6 rolls and things like that. But he actually came up with mechanics where you rolled the dice and the results were actually on the dice. And that actually simplified a whole process that he could have made you do instead and made a less successful game by there. But he was clever enough to take it that step further and go like, no, actually what we can do is we can produce special dice and they will do the job for you. that kind of thinking. The idea that a game is more than just the rules that you write for it. It's also about the whole package, the presentation, the size of the models, the way they're presented, how they interact with each other, the distances they are apart on tabletops. All that kind of stuff are things that I learned from Jervis more than anything else. And, I talk about Blood Box, that's a nice, clean, specific example, but we did this all the time with 40K. We didn't just play battle reports with each other. We used to play usually several times a week and try out different ideas, different concepts, different ways of playing the game, which all in turn fed into doing second edition. The whole idea of having mission cards and war gear cards and stuff like that, it was all kind of like outflow from that. So, yeah, really heavily. I really missed it when he moved to doing specialist games, but at the same time, he let me do my own thing more. So, swings roundabouts.
So is there a game that you did not create that you love to play?
Yeah, all kinds of them, really. part of the pleasure is not playing your own games sometimes. There's one that I really like. There's a historical game called Rommel by Sam Staffer. He's done several historical games. A lot of them are kind of pike and shot style periods, Alburian, Napoleonic. But Rommel's actually World War II. And that's a really great game. Again, it's a tremendously simple game mechanically, but the application of it is incredibly clever. It actually produces the best Second World War games that I've played, working at a kind of like company, battalion, regimental kind of level. We use 1/200 scale stuff for it, but you can scale down further if you wanted to. And that's a really, really great game. That's a game I've played, lots of times and gone back and like, ooh, we must play more. And yeah.
So as we finish up here, is there anything that you would like to talk about that we have not actually talked about?
I think we touched on most things overall. One of the things that I perhaps haven't touched on is how much things have changed over the 30 years I've been doing this for, and how much more opportunity there is now for anybody to be creative and to get it out to an audience, which I think has raised the bar an awful long way. You see professionally painted models, you see professionally made terrain all the time. And I think the biggest message I put out there is, that's fine. Don't forget it's cool to do things for yourself. You will be able to build terrain even without having sculpted miniatures made beautifully to allow you to do that, and so on. The craft of tabletop gaming and so on, it extends beyond what you could just buy with your wallet, really. And it's interesting to see 3D printing come around now, because it's actually opening that up again, of like people can actually create their own stuff and to a seriously professional level. So I'm very excited by that prospect. It's slowly starting to blow the roof off tabletop gaming in a way that I haven't seen in a long time. So I'm excited for the future on that front. So there you go. That's what I've got for you.
One last thing. Do you have any insight into what happened to the squats or Malal?
Malal was caught up in ownership battles, basically. Because was it Brett Ewins wrote about Malal? And
there was a 4-part comic book, if I remember right.
Yeah, and basically he owned it. So that meant the Games Workshop couldn't use it without paying him for rights, and they weren't going to do that, especially when they had 4 of the Chaos Gods anyway. So that's what happened to Malal. Squats is a weird one, because they just kind of like died on the vine more than anything else. We did an armies for them when we did second edition of 40K. They're in the black book for that. But they never quite managed to make it onto the Codex schedule before it became time to do third edition. And by the time it came around to do third edition, it was like, do we really want to keep squats, considering we haven't done new miniatures for them or a new codex in X number of years at this point? And nobody seems to really be complaining about it either. And the general response was, no, we should drop them and do like Dark Eldar, because Dark Elves were really popular in Warhammer and had proved so many times. So it was like, well, we should do some Dark Eldar. And, expand 40K that way rather than trying to pump stuff into a range that apparently nobody cares about. Because I'm telling you, man, nobody cared. Nobody cared until they were gone.
Yeah.
And now it's all, oh, boo-hoo, they took my spots away. It's like, well, dude, there was a period of several years where you could have made a ruckus about it, but nobody apparently did. But there again, to be fair, we are talking fairly pre-internet days as well. I'm sure there would be howls going on if it were to happen today. But back then we got snail mail and that was about it, really. So
all right. Well, I want to thank you for being on All Ones, and you have a very nice day.
My pleasure. Nice talking to you. Thanks for having me on.
It looks like our team is egressing. That means it's time to go, chummers. See you next time, All Ones.